In this next episode of our Jerusalem from Genesis to Jesus series, we explore 1st century Jerusalem, the city Jesus knew and loved. Behind me, the city of Jerusalem. Under the rule of King Herod, this city's landscape changed drastically. Herod was a master builder. He expanded the Temple Mount and completely refurbished the temple, making it one of the wonders of the ancient world. And Herod's Jerusalem was the Jerusalem of Jesus. The beloved city Jesus knew would one day crumble to the ground. So let's go back in time to the 1st century to learn a bit more about King Herod and to see the way in which he transformed this holy city that Jesus and his followers were so familiar with. 1st century Jerusalem has always fascinated me. That's because it is the city Jesus would have known and loved. Yet King Herod, the mastermind behind 1st century Jerusalem, was a very ruthless man. In the Gospel of Matthew's story about the birth of Jesus, it is Herod who commanded the slaughter of thousands of male Jewish children under the age of 2 if they lived near Bethlehem. And according to historians, this Bible story is not out of character for King Herod at all. Talk to us a little bit about Jerusalem under the rule of King Herod. What brought about the end of the Hasmonean dynasty?
So the Hasmonean dynasty ends with basically Judah the Maccabee, who led the initial revolt, made an alliance with the Romans. We're talking about in the 3rd century, there's that 2nd century. There's that expression in the Middle East, my enemy's enemy is my friend. So Rome is already emerging as a major world power. Judah never calls in that, the Romans for help. But fast forward literally a century later, and the descendants of the Maccabees, 2 brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, are fighting a civil war over who's going to be in charge. And the Romans are invited in to mediate. And what do the Romans don't mediate? The Romans just conquer. And Pompey Magnus shows up in 63 BC, and he conquers the land of Israel and makes it the Roman province of Judea. The story is much more complicated than I want to go into now, but ultimately, the advisor to one of these 2 Maccabean descendants is a man by the name of Antipater, who's an Edomite convert to Judaism. He puts his children in power. And one of them is Herod, who he makes the governor of the Galilee first. And he shows himself to be quite brutal, but quite adept at maneuvering politically. And in all of the chaos that emerges at this period of time in the Roman Empire, with different generals killing each other out for who's going to be in power, the last man standing after all this is over is a man by the name of Octavian, who becomes Augustus, the first great Roman Caesar. And Augustus will make Herod the king of Israel. He has no right to be king. He's not a descendant of King David, but he becomes a client king, a vassal state of the Roman Empire. And Herod is a fascinating person because on one hand, he is very brutal and very paranoid, and being illegitimate, he's very sensitive to his position. Mm-hmm. The great Jewish historian Josephus tells us that he marries the last surviving Maccabean female. Her name is Miriam. If you're not legitimate, marry a Jewish princess. He, by the way, is very insanely jealous of her. He ends up murdering her in a fit of rage. He ends up killing his own kids from that relationship. He ends up murdering Miriam's brother, who's Aristobulus the high priest, because he was a Maccabee and he's legitimate and he's the real deal. So Augustus, who liked him, said it's better to be his pig than one of his kids. So that's his kind of paranoid, dangerous side, kind of like Joseph Stalin. But the other thing about Herod is he loves to build. He's one of the greatest builders in the ancient world. He builds Caesarea Maritima, this huge port that equals Piraeus or Ostia in Athens outside Rome. And he builds Masada, that incredible mountain fortress. He rebuilds the walls around Jerusalem. He makes the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He expands it and makes the temple the largest functioning religious site in the world. Even the rabbis who hated him because he killed most of them. When he finished the temple, they write in the Mishnah, in the oral law, if you haven't seen the house of Herod, you've never seen a house in your life. And part of that was for ego. Part of that was to compensate for Jerusalem kind of being out of the way. He wanted to be like, he wanted to make it a big city. I don't want to make this some little rinky-dink Midwest city. I want to make this like New York or Los Angeles. And he builds the biggest city in the Eastern Roman Empire with the biggest religious site in the world. He builds a huge temple in Caesarea to Augustus. He was a very complicated, dangerous, fascinating human being, but certainly one of the most interesting political leaders of 2,000 years ago.
So safe to say Jerusalem really was transformed under his leadership as far as, visibly.
Oh, physically, absolutely. It was, if you're familiar with the size of the old city of today, it's twice the size of the city of today. What's all outside to the south, which is called the City of David, was in the walls, and what's all to the north was in the walls, up to what is City Hall of today. We find pieces of that wall. So they estimate that 100 to 150,000 people were living in the city. And remember, there's no one living outside really the walls at that period of time. There's farmland, but people aren't living out there. So the city it's Jerusalem in all of its physical glory. If you want to appreciate that, you go to the Israel Museum and you look at the model, the Holy Land Hotel, and the model that they have, and you can see what an incredible piece of construction it was.
Despite King Herod's illegitimate kingship and brutality, there is no doubt that he was an incredible builder. Today, overlooking Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, the city looks incredibly different than it has throughout most of its history. But at the Israel Museum, an incredible model of Jerusalem provides a well-educated glimpse into what first-century Jerusalem might have really looked like. And thankfully, there are massive amounts of archaeology related to this period that help the Jerusalem of Jesus come to life. Well, Isaac, we are back here on the southern side of the Temple Mount, down below. Tell me what I'm seeing here.
Straight ahead, we can see part of the southern wall of the Temple Mount. Remember that the Jews always saw Herod as a traitor, as a man who betrayed his own people. Now, Herod asked himself, what can I do in order to please these people? How can I make peace with them? Now, since Herod knew that the second temple, which is right here on top of Mount Moriah, was the most holy place in the world for them, in order to please them, he decided to build for them the Temple Mount. Now, what does it mean? In order to build the Temple Mount, first of all, King Herod, he built 4 huge retaining walls around Mount Moriah. What is going to happen if here and now I'm going to build a big, tall, vertical wall? I'm going to create a lot of empty space between my wall to the top of the mountain. So what King Herod did, something genius. He filled the space between the 4 retaining walls to the top of Mount Moriah with thousands of arches and vaults, one on top of the another. So this is how eventually on top, around the temple, he created a very big plaza. And this plaza is known as Temple Mount. Can you imagine to yourself that up there, Herod's time, they had enough space for 500,000 people, all at the same time. So now when we talk about Jesus, remember when Jesus came to Jerusalem, this is what he saw. He saw the Temple Mount that was built by King Herod.
Okay, wow. One of my favorite things about exploring the southern slope of the Temple Mount is that from here, you can truly say you are walking exactly where Jesus walked 2,000 years ago. From here, you can see the Hulda gates through which pilgrims would enter the temple precincts. And you can see the double gates where pilgrims would exit. All right, Isaac, we're on the steps. Talk to me about these steps leading up to the Second Temple.
Very important steps. So over here, we can see some of the original Herodian steps. These steps were built in order to lead the people all the way to the gates and from the gates. But here we can see something very weird. You can see that this step where I'm standing is quite a wide step.
Right.
The next one is very narrow. This one is very wide narrow, wide, narrow, etc., etc.
Why is that?
So we're talking about a very difficult stairway. And again, why is that? Very good question. In Judaism, we say that when you approach a holy place, physically, you must slow down. Why? Because in Judaism, we say before you approach a holy place, you have to prepare your heart and your mind to the holy place that you are about to enter to.
Okay.
Now, when the pilgrims came to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, they came here as very big families with children. And children, even 2,000 years ago, liked to run. So the architect who designed the stairway said, no way, I have to make sure that everybody must slow down, even the children. How can I do that? By that he made a staircase to be very difficult staircase. So this is how physically he made everybody to slow down. Now, another important thing, we can say for sure, without a doubt, that Jesus walked up and down this staircase. How do we know that? Because the Bible tells us that when he was 12 years old, his parents took him to the temple in Jerusalem. So when Jesus and his parents came to Jerusalem, only way for them to get to the temple was to climb up this stairway to the triple gate, and through the triple gate up to the Temple Mount. And as the Bible tells us later on, when his parents were on their way back home, after that they walked for a day, they realized that their son was missing.
Right.
Then they returned back to Jerusalem, and 3 days later, where exactly was the place where they found their son? On Temple Mount, among the teachers and the priests, when all of them were astonished and amazed from his answering and understanding. And then the only way for Jesus and his parents to come out from the Temple Mount was through the double gate and down these stairs. Or the week of the Passover. Remember when Jesus came to Jerusalem for the week of the Passover, the city was very, very crowded. So during that week, every night, he didn't stay inside the city. He stayed in the town of Bethany, in the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. During that week, every morning, he came to the temple. So during that week, the only way how he could make it to the temple was to come here, to climb up these stairs to the triple gate, to the temple, where he stayed all day long.
Right.
End of the day, through the double gate, outside, down to these stairs, and back to Bethany. Think about
And
it.
Bethany's just over top of the hill of the
Mount of Olives, exactly,
Right.
on the
Okay.
eastern side of this mountain. But think about it, we can say for sure that if he could be here on this stairway during that week of the Passover, every morning and every afternoon, we could see him on these ancient, original, 2,000 years old Hulda steps.
Amazing. Don't go away. When we come back, I walk through the marketplace beside the temple and see first century coins that were used to pay temple taxes.
The nation of Israel and the Jewish people have just suffered horrendous attacks not seen since World War II. However, Israel and the Jewish people are not alone. First Century Foundations has been actively supporting the people of Israel for nearly 40 years, providing food, clothing, and shelter for those in need, especially in these desperate times. When you give a gift of $30 or more, you are not only helping support the people of Israel, you are also showing that you care and are blessing God's chosen people in their hour of need. And when you give your gift, as a thank you, you will receive the bi-monthly newsletter and Israel Prayer Watch. And for monthly donations, we will send you the book, Praying for the Peace of Jerusalem. Call now, 1-877-628-2800, or visit us online at firstcenturyfoundations.com and help the people of Israel during these dangerous times.
It is always thrilling to walk exactly where Jesus walked the many times he entered and exited the temple. Jesus loved this place from the time he was a young child. The Bible tells us that when Money changers set up their tables in the temple precincts. It infuriated Jesus, and he drove them out. Jesus was zealous for the temple and demanded that it was respected as a house of prayer for Israel and the nations, not a place for other business. Isaac, we're learning so much today. What are we looking at right now?
So over here, Jeff, we see something super interesting, southwest corner of the Temple Mount that was built by King Herod.
Okay.
From the corner to the right, this is the beginning of the southern wall. From the corner to the left, this is the beginning of the western wall. So southwest corner of the Temple Mount. If we focus in the central and the lower part of the corner, originally Herodian. You can see the big stones.
Yes.
Israeli archaeologists wanted to have an idea, approximately, what is the weight of these stones? And here is the result of the research. They came to the conclusion that the smallest stone here weighed only half American ton. The biggest, which is the heaviest stone, 650 tons.
Wow.
Imagine to yourself 650 tons. Think about it, how difficult and complicated it was 2,000 years ago to carve such big heavy stones. How complicated it was to transfer these stones all the way here.
Crazy.
How difficult and complicated it was to lift up the stones and to put one stone on top of the another in a such accurate way.
Amazing. Now, what else are we seeing here from this view? We've got this long western wall.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about what we see above.
Now, up above us, we can see the beginning of Robinson's Arch. Robinson's Arch was a part of an ancient interchange, perhaps the most ancient interchange in the world. Now, what do we have here? Down below us, you can see this Herodian street. Soon we talk more about it. From this Herodian street, there was a staircase that led to the top of this big arch. So the arch functioned like a big bridge, while on top of the arch, there was another entrance to the Temple Mount, the royal entrance to the Temple Mount.
Ah, okay.
So if you are a Herod friend or a very rich, you don't have to wait in very long lines in front of all the gates.
Right.
You would simply come here, up the stairs, on top of the bridge, straight into the Temple Mount.
Why don't we go down and show our viewers the street below?
With pleasure.
Okay, let's
go.
We walked up the 2,000-year-old street that would have started at the Pool of Siloam and went north along the western wall of the Temple Mount. In the 1st century, this street was lined with shops and served as a marketplace for visitors to the temple.
We know that the shops that were on this side of the street belonged to money changers. How do we know that? Because about 50% of the coins that were found here were coins of what we can call foreign currency.
Oh, okay. So people from other places
Who came to Jerusalem
for the
holidays.
and the holy days. Okay.
And the other 50% of the coins that were found here, half of a shekel. Remember, in those days, every pilgrim that came to Jerusalem had to pay the temple tax.
Temple tax, that's right.
Only way to pay the temple tax was with the local Israeli coin, half of a shekel.
All right. Exploring the endless archaeological remains of the 1st century temple in Jerusalem brings so many scriptures about Jesus to life. Bible stories about the temple, money changers, and tax collectors scattered throughout the Gospels become a little more tangible. Jesus, as a faithful Jew, would have also paid taxes to the temple. So while visiting the Israel Museum, I was eager to see one of these coins with my own eyes and, hopefully, hold one in my hand. Well, I'm here today with Dr. Robert Kuhl, the head of the coin department at the Israel Antiquities Authority. And before we get too far into our conversation, we also want to say a special thank you to Yoli Schwartz, the official spokesperson of the Israel Antiquities Authority. And Dr. Kuhl, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Dr. Kuhl, we were just recently at the Davidson Center and looking at a couple of things that involve money. Speaking about the temple tax and that people would come and pay for, their doves or whatever they needed for sacrifice. Do we have an example of money from that period, that time of Jesus?
Oh, yes, we do. I mean, this is a prime example. We have this huge hoard, which was discovered many, many, many years ago in what is now the Druze village of Isfia, but it used to be a Jewish village 2,000 years ago. And this hoard, which I think we have a couple of hundred of these coins, which was a much larger hoard of thousands of coins. This hoard were probably money that was to be sent as the temple tax.
Oh,
because
okay.
these, what you see here, are the shkalim and the half shkalim, which were paid by every male Jew every year to the temple. And these are the same coins about which Jesus talks, about the turning of the tables, the 30 silverlings for which Jesus was betrayed. These are the coins, nothing else. These are the coins.
Fantastic.
And they date to that period, because the coins are dated very narrowly from the 1st century to the BCE, from the 1st century ECE. So it's exactly the period of when Jesus lived.
May I hold one?
Of course. I must tell you something interesting about it, because this was the most important coin in Judaism around the time of the Second Temple.
Okay.
But the coin, look at the coin, it's completely pagan. The coin was not even minted in the land of Israel. The coin was minted in Tyre, on the Lebanese coast, in a Phoenician city. And what you see on the obverse is Hercules, the local variety of Hercules.
Okay.
And on the other side you see a symbol of imperial authority of
It's like a bird.
yeah, it's the eagle.
The eagle,
Yeah.
okay.
And it has, of course, Greek inscriptions. So it's a completely pagan coin, but it was the most important coin used by the Jews at that time.
Wow, I wouldn't have thought that.
No, of course, nobody really understands this. But this was because the Jews didn't have other silver coin. This was the most important silver coin. So again, we have this mix of pagans, religion. Life is complicated.
Now, you used a different term than shekel. I've always, shekel, half shekel. You used another term.
Well, we as numismatists, these coins are called tetradrachmas also. But yeah, the Jews called them shekel, half shekels.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you.
Don't go away. When we come back, I see Herod's handiwork a little closer in the Western Wall tunnels with the former District Archaeologist of Jerusalem.
I was a pastor for over 20 years before I first went to Israel, only to realize that I had been totally disconnected from the roots of my faith. Since then, I've been on a journey of discovery, and my faith has come alive in ways I never could have imagined. I'm Jeff Futers, Director of First Century Foundations, and I am excited to invite you on my journey to the foundations of our faith, to discover your part in a Bible story that isn't over yet. First Century Foundations exists to reconnect Christians to the foundations of Christianity. And we do this by creating Bible-based media focused on Israel and the Jewish roots of our faith. But we don't just reconnect you to Israel's history, we help you participate in what God is doing in Israel today by connecting you to over 70 incredible ministries in Israel who desperately need our support. Will you partner with us? Together, we'll explore Israel's significant past while doing our part to ensure that Israel has a bright future.
It was so exhilarating to hold a first century Jewish coin in my hand at the Israel Museum. But exploring the archaeology of Jerusalem just would not be complete without a visit with my good friend, Dr. Dan Bahat. the archaeologist who led excavations in the Western Wall tunnels. So I asked him to take me a little closer to where the original temple once stood, to see some pristine examples of King Herod's Temple Mount.
Where we are standing here, you can see the best example of the Herodian work. Why is that? Unlike as you have in the Prayer Plaza, this was never exposed, or I say for the last 2,000 years it was not exposed to the sun, and it was, no one touched it even, so that's why it is kept in a perfect shape. If you look at this enormous wall, and you think that it is over 2,000 years old, and how the size of the stones, and the beauty of the carving of the stone, imagine every stone has individual margins. It is really unique. Just to give you an example, you see every stone, and look at the size of the stone. Every stone has got margins, see? But the beautiful thing is that the protruding part, which is in the middle, it has got also its own margins. In some places, even the margins have got small margins in it. It is unique in the world. And if you think it is Herod's Temple Mount, the one which we see today, is actually the biggest religious structure in the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah,
It is
wow.
enormous. It is enormous. This wall is about half a kilometer long.
It's
About half a
incredible.
kilometer long, yes.
And everywhere we see this kind of stone, we know that it's Herodian.
It is Herodian. Now, today, as I said, Herod started to build it in 20 BC. Herod died in 4 BC, which is very important also from other point of view. Remember that Herod and Jesus have to be at a certain time together because of the killing of the innocents.
Right.
You see? So it is interesting. So anyhow, Herod had, let's say, about 16 to 20 years of chance to build it. And already, as I said, we know from John that it was 46 years at least when they were still working on it. So today we know that the Roman procurators also continued in their time. They also continued the work. It is still very, very difficult to assume who built when and so. But we say Herodian because the initiative was Herodian, the beginnings are Herodian,
Right.
the means to do it is Herodian, so it is an Herodian structure.
Makes sense.
Yes. Yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor
Okay.
Bahat.
You're welcome.
It has been so interesting exploring King Herod's Jerusalem with you and imagining the splendor of this city that was so familiar to Jesus and his earliest followers. Imagine how shocked the followers of Jesus would have been when he told them that every massive stone would one day come falling to the ground. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explored this intriguing time in Jerusalem's history. Please join me again next time, right here in God's holy city, as we continue our quest to discover Jerusalem from Genesis to Jesus.